Chapter 3: Interdependence and the Gains from Trade. In these chapters, the following are the questions we look for answers. Why do people and nations choose to be economically interdependent? How can trade make everyone better off? What is absolute advantage? What is comparative advantage? How are these concepts similar? How are they different? Ask the experts. Trade between China and the United States. Trade with China makes most Americans better off because, among other advantages, they can buy goods that are made or assembled more cheaply in China. 100% of economists agree. Trade is a good thing. Let's look at interdependence. Interdependence is to rely on many people from around the world, most of whom you have never met, to provide you with the goods and services you enjoy. Trade can make everyone better off. That's one of the 10 principles from Chapter 1. We now learn why people and nations choose to be interdependent and how they can gain from trade. Our example. Let's make assumptions. We are assuming two countries, the United States and Japan, they're trading in two goods, airplanes and soybeans. And there is one resource, that's labor, measured in hours. We want to determine how much of both goods each country produces and consumes. If the country chooses to be self-sufficient, or if it trades with the other country. Example 1, the US. The US economy has 50,000 labor hours per month available for production. US produces only two goods, airplanes and soybeans. To produce one plane requires 500 labor hours. To produce 1 ton of soybeans requires 10 labor hours. Let's build a model here. We're building the production possibilities frontier. In combination A, we build employment of labor hours. If we employ 50,000 labor hours building planes, we will use 0 hours building soybeans, and with that we can build 100 planes and 0 soybeans. Combination B, if we reduce the number of hours from 50,000 to 40,000 and use 10,000 to produce soybeans, then we can produce 80 airplanes and 1,000 soybeans. In combination C, we reduce planes and labor hours from 40 to 25,000 and use the other 25,000 to produce soybeans. That will give us 50 airplanes and 2,500 tons of soybeans. In combination D, we reduce airplanes from 25,000 to 10,000 labor hours, and we use 40,000 labor hours to produce soybeans. That will give us 20 planes and 4,000 soybeans. And last but not least, we reduce airplane production to 0, and produce only soybeans, that means we use all the 50,000 labor hours to produce soybeans, we will have 0 planes and 5,000 tons of soybeans. If we plot that information, we find total production possibilities frontier with all those combinations. Produce only airplanes, we produce 100. We can produce 80 planes and 1,000 soybeans, 50 planes and 2,500 soybeans, 20 planes and 4,000 soybeans, or just soybeans, we produce 5,000. US has enough labor hours to produce 100 planes or 5,000 tons of soybeans or any combination along the production possibilities frontier. Suppose the US uses half its labor to produce each of the two goods. The US production and consumption would be 50 planes and 2,500 tons of soybeans, which you can see on the graph right here. Active Learning 1, derive Japan's production possibilities frontier. Use the following information to draw Japan's PPF. Japan has 30,000 labor hours per month available for production. Japan also produces two goods, airplanes and soybeans. To produce one plane, Japan requires 625 labor hours. To produce 1 ton of soybean, Japan requires 25 labor hours. Your graph should measure soybeans in tons on the horizontal axis. And the answer should appear on this graph. Japan has enough labor hours to produce 48 planes or 1,200 tons of soybeans, or any combination thereof on the PPF. And this is the Japan's production possibilities frontier. Suppose Japan uses half its labor, just like the United States did, to produce each of the two goods. Japan's production and consumption would be 24 airplanes, that is half of 48, and 600 tons of soybeans, which is half of 1,200. Consumption with and without trade. Without trade, U.S. consumes, as we have seen, U.S. consumers get 50 airplanes and 2,500 tons of soybeans. Japan consumers get 24 airplanes and 600 tons of soybeans. Comparison, consumption without trade versus consumption with trade. We need to see how much of each good is produced and traded by the two countries. Active Learning 2, production under trade. We continue example 1 and active learning 1, but this time the two countries will choose different points. Number A, US produces 3,500 tons of soybeans. How many airplanes can the US produce with the remaining resources? Draw this point on the PPF. Number B, Japan produces 48 airplanes. How many tons of soybeans can Japan produce with the remaining resources? Draw this point on the PPF. Active Learning 2. Answer, US production with trade. We can see that producing 3,500 tons of soybeans requires 3,500 times 10, which is equal to 35,000 labor hours used. The remaining, that is 50,000 labor hours, minus 35,000 is equal to 15 labor hours, which are now used to produce 30 airplanes. That is 15,000 divided by 500. If you show that on the graph, it appears like this: 30 airplanes and 3,500 tons of soybeans. What about Japan? Japan producing 48 airplanes requires all of Japan's resources, and that is 48 times 625. Remember, you require 625 to produce one plane. So if you multiply 48 by 625, you get 30,000 labor hours. And so Japan would produce 0 tons of soybeans and produce 48 planes. And it is on the intercept if you look at the graph. Let's get them to trade with each other. Exports are goods produced abroad and sold domestically. No, that is imports. Imports are goods produced abroad and sold domestically. And exports are goods produced domestically and sold abroad. Active Learning 3, Consumption under Trade. We continue Active Learning 2, but this time the two countries will be able to trade 22 airplanes for 880 tons of soybeans. Number A, U.S. exports 880 tons of soybeans and imports 22 airplanes. How much of each good is consumed in the United States? Plot this combination on the US PPF. Number B, Japan exports 22 airplanes and imports 880 tons of soybeans. How much of each good is consumed in Japan? Plot this combination on Japan's PPF. Let's look at the table here. United States consumption with trade. So here, United States produced 30 planes and 3,500 tons of soybeans, as you can see. And it imports 22 airplanes from Japan. That means no soybeans. Okay, it does not import any soybeans. So United States exports 800 soybeans and 0 planes. So what is the amount of consumption in the United States? 30 plus 22 is 52 airplanes, and 3,500 tons plus 880 tons is equal to 2620. If we plot this information on the graph, we find that US is now consuming outside its production possibilities frontier. Remember, the point outside this curve is not attainable under normal circumstance. But here, with trade, United States can consume outside the production possibilities, as opposed to domestically. If US was not trading with Japan, its original consumption was 50 airplanes and 2,500 tons of soybeans. So clearly there's some benefits to trade here. Let's look at Japan. Japan was producing now 48 planes and producing 0 soybeans, and Japan imports 880 tons of soybeans and exports 22 airplanes to the United States. So Japan's consumption would be 48 minus 22. It produced 48, it sent 22 to the United States, so Japan is left with 26 airplanes. and Japan was producing zero soybeans, it imports 880 tons from the United States, and Japan can now consume 880. Let's look at Japan's consumption. This is now plotted on the graph, and you can see that 26 airplanes and 880 soybeans is outside Japan's production possibilities frontier. There is some benefits from trade here. As opposed to before trade, Japan could consume 24 airplanes and 600 tons of soybeans. Trade makes both countries better off, as we can see. Okay, United States consumption without trade was 50. Consumption with trade is 52. Gains from trade is 2. Soybeans consumption without trade was 50. Consumption with trade was 2,620. Gains from trade is the difference, which is 120. Let's do the same for Japan. Consumption without trade, Japan could consume 24 airplanes and uh, uh, and 26 could consume 26 airplanes with trade. The benefit from trade is 2 airplanes. Soybeans, Japan could only consume 600 without trade, but consume 880 with trade. The benefit from trade is 280 tons of soybeans. So where do these gains come from? Let's distinguish let's define some concepts here. Absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. In our example, absolute advantage in soybeans, the US producing 1 ton of soybeans uses 10 labor hours in the United States versus 25 labor hours in Japan. So United States has absolute advantage in the production of soybeans. US has also absolute advantage in the production of airplanes. US producing 1 airplane takes 625 labor hours in Japan, but only 500 labor hours in the United States. So clearly, United States has absolute advantage in the production of airplanes. The US has absolute advantage in both goods. So why does Japan specialize in airplanes? Why do both countries gain from trade then? Two countries can gain from trade when each specializes in the good it produces at lowest cost. The two measures of cost of a good. One measure is absolute advantage. Absolute advantage measures the cost of a good in terms of the inputs required to produce it. Another measure of cost is opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of an airplane is equal to the amount of soybeans that could be produced using the labor needed to produce one computer. Comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. The principle of comparative advantage. Each good should be produced by the individual that has the smaller opportunity cost of producing that good. Specialize according to comparative advantage. Example 2, comparative advantage. The US produced 1 airplane using 500 labor hours. produce 1 ton of soybeans using 10 labor hours. Japan produced 1 airplane using 625 labor hours and produced 1 ton of soybeans using 25 labor hours. Number A, for each country, calculate the opportunity cost of producing each good. Number B, which country has comparative advantage in the production of soybeans? Number C, which country has comparative advantage in the production of airplanes? Answer. The US produced 1 airplane using 500 labor hours, but using the 500 labor hours to produce soybeans would have produced 500 divided by 10, and that is 50 tons of soybeans. The opportunity cost of 1 airplane is 50 tons of soybeans. Opportunity cost of 1 ton of soybean is equal to 0.02 of airplanes. In Japan, opportunity cost of 1 airplane is 25 tons of soybeans. The opportunity cost of 1 ton of soybean is equal to 0.04 airplanes. Comparative advantage. The opportunity cost of producing 1 airplane in the US is 50 tons of soybeans. Opportunity cost of producing 1 ton of soybean in the US is 0.02 airplanes. The opportunity cost of producing 1 airplane in Japan is 25 tons of soybeans. The opportunity cost of producing 1 ton of soybean is 0.04 airplanes. Comparative advantage in airplanes. Japan has a comparative advantage in producing airplanes because Japan only has to give up 25 tons of soybeans. That is less than 50 for the United States. Comparative advantage in soybeans. The US has comparative advantage in the production of soybeans because the US has the lowest opportunity cost of producing soybeans. So, comparative advantage and trade. Gains from trade arise from comparative advantage, that is, differences in opportunity cost. When each country specializes in the goods in which it has comparative advantage, total production in all countries is higher. The world's economic pie is bigger. All countries can gain from trade. The price of the trade. The price of trade must lie between their opportunity costs. In our example, 22 airplanes were traded for 880 tons of soybeans. So the price of trade is 1 airplane for 40 tons of soybeans. This is greater than Japan's opportunity cost of 1 airplane is 25 tons of soybeans, but it is lower than the US opportunity cost of 1 airplane, which is 50 tons of soybeans. Active learning. Let's look at Argentina and Brazil. Argentina has got 10,000 hours of labor per month. They are producing 1 pound of coffee, which requires 2 hours, and producing 1 bottle of wine, which requires 4 hours. Brazil has 10,000 hours of labor per month. Producing 1 pound of coffee requires 1 hour in Brazil, producing 1 bottle of wine requires 5 hours in Brazil. Number A, which country has an absolute advantage in the production of coffee? Number B, which country has a comparative advantage in the production of wine? Answer. Number A, absolute advantage in the production of coffee, that is fewer resources to produce 1 pound of coffee, Brazil. In Brazil, 1 labor hour in Brazil, but 2 in Argentina. Number B, which country has a comparative advantage in the production of wine? Producing wine at the lowest opportunity cost. That is Argentina's opportunity cost of wine is equal to 2 pounds of coffee. Brazil's opportunity cost of wine is equal to 5 pounds of coffee. So Argentina has the lowest opportunity cost. Ask the experts about trade between China and the United States. Some Americans who work in the production of competing goods, such as clothing and furniture, are made worse off by trade with China. That is true. 96% of economists agree, 4% are uncertain. Think, pair, and share. You're watching an election debate on television. A candidate says we need to stop the flow of foreign steel into our country. If we place a tariff on imports of steel, our domestic steel production will rise and the United States will be better off. Number A, will the US be better off if we limit steel imports? Explain. Number B, will anyone in the United States be better off if we limit steel imports? Explain. Number C, in the real world, does every person in the country gain when restriction on imports are reduced? Explain. Think about that. Summary. Chapter in a nutshell. Interdependence and trade are desirable. Allow everyone to enjoy greater quantity and variety of goods and services. Comparative advantage is being able to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. Absolute advantage is being able to produce a good with fewer inputs. The gains from trade are based on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. Trade makes everyone better off. It allows people to specialize in those activities in which they have a comparative advantage. The principle of comparative advantage applies to countries as well as to people. Economists use the principle of comparative advantage to advocate free trade among countries.